Good morning, everyone. It's so lovely to be here with you in this beautiful setting. And I think it's a little unfair that they've set the podium up here and the screen here where you can so very easily just sort of drift those eyes to either side and look at that stunning view of the changing colors. So hopefully we can work together. You can maybe listen while you're enjoying that lovely view. I have prepared slides for you, so I don't know that they're quite as lovely, but you'll notice that I've got some of the same colors going on. So maybe that'll help keep our attention here together. So I want to talk today about spiritual gifts, but I want to talk about spiritual gifts in the context of the work that we do. And we're going to think about that in two ways, both professionally, sort of in the large scope of the work that you do with the law, but also very specifically in your leadership roles here in the J. Reuben Clark Law Society. So those may be things for many people that might not seem like a natural pairing, but for you, this might make perfect sense, right, just from the outset. But we're going to go through this together. The other thing that I want to acknowledge right here at the outset is this very concept of spiritual gifts relies on some concepts that are deeply rooted in Western religious tradition. And one of the things that I'm going to try to do is expand that scope a little bit to include other faith perspectives and other spiritual practices to make sure that when you are engaging with these concepts, it's something that you can share with others in a way that's inclusive. I want to be clear up front, though, I am not a religious scholar, and I'm not an expert in any of these world traditions, and I am intending not to do violence to these other traditions that are not my own faith tradition, but rather to be as inclusive as possible. I welcome any corrections that you may be aware of if I misstep. And I ask your forgiveness in those cases, and we can all learn together. So the first thing, and you guys got a little preview of this slide, the first thing I want to do is think about a broad scope of spiritual practice. And I don't know if you recognize this photo. How many of you have been to Chaco Canyon down in New Mexico? A few of you, but maybe not a lot of you. This is a stunning set of ancient ruins where you can see the trappings of an ancient civilization that was clearly at one point thriving. And I went, this was my one trip during COVID era that I took. Some girlfriends and I quarantined for 2 weeks, made sure, we were all tested and everything. And then the five of us piled into a car and drove down to New Mexico where like no one else was in this space right then, and wandered around these ruins outside in relative solitude. And that experience, especially in the context of a global pandemic, gave a lot of opportunity for reflection. And one of the things that I reflected on as I was walking through these paths that these ancient peoples had walked through was the fact that humanity faces similar problems. Wherever you live, whenever you live, we face similar problems. We need food, we need water, we need shelter, we need sanitation. These are basic problems that wherever you go in the world, these problems might be solved in different ways. If you think about international travel, right, sometimes you'll encounter systems that are solving the same problems but look different or feel different, but we're all solving these same problems. And one of the things that really struck me about this experience was that these people were clearly spiritually engaged as well. And it occurred to me that in addition to food and water and shelter and sanitation, one of the great unifying human hungers is this hunger for spiritual growth. And I mean spirituality broadly, because I know not all faith traditions view the spirit in the same way. So when I talk about that, one way to think about it and one way to talk about it is the hope for a higher state of existence. The hope to connect with something that is divine. And that for me was a very profound experience, one that is difficult to replicate with a photo on a screen. But I hope that you can think about that and think about the experiences that you've had at other sites where you're looking at the spiritual manifestations of people's faith traditions. And The Buddha said that just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life. And I love that idea. So we're going to talk a little bit about that spiritual life today and how we can enhance that spiritual life through our daily work and our daily practices and our leadership in the Law Society, but also how that work and service and leadership can in turn strengthen our spiritual selves. This can be a reinforcing gift. So briefly, many of you have much more experience than I do with religious traditions, and I'm only going to cover a few of these, and I acknowledge that some of these are intertwined and overlapping, and that any one of these traditions may have many manifestations in societies. So like to summarize these in one line is like, I mean, if you think about your own faith and your conversion and your journey and your experience and all the things that have brought you to this point in life, and you try to like boil it down to one line that like you're going to tell other people like this is what you believe. Clearly this is a simplification, but just to sort of set the stage as we move forward and talk about different approaches, I wanted to kind of lay this groundwork. So for example, in Hinduism, we might view one of the objectives or ways that we think about what a spiritual gift might be. We might think about manifestations of the divine. And in that tradition, freedom from mortality is synonymous with unity with the divine. And one of the things that seekers do is try to receive manifestations of the divine during mortality, just like these little peaks of what that might be. And it's described as like divinity sort of revealing itself to you, which I think is just a really beautiful, beautiful idea. In Buddhism, deep truth can be found through meditation. There are 4 specific truths that the Buddha teaches that have a lot to do with sort of the path and what you're trying to understand as you walk that path. And a lot of those truths have to do with understanding the pains and travails of mortality. And if you can gain a deep understanding of like the truth of what that is, it can free you from that. In Confucianism, there's a much more sort of collective view, and that view is that people are good, and that society can be organized in ways that help bring that goodness to the fore and help each other to magnify one another's goodness and to create systems that elevate people by enhancing that goodness. And in Taoism, there's this idea that peace is harmony with the divine patterns of nature, that where a lot of difficulty comes from is when we're fighting against natural patterns. And so rather than fighting against the energies that are coming toward us or through us or existing around us, we can work with those energies and flow with them to receive peace and harmony. And ultimately the goal is to have this sense of unity with all of like the universe. It's like everything comes together. The more Western traditions include Christianity, which focuses on the example, teachings, and resurrection and redemptive power of Jesus Christ. And that by following that example and his teachings, and also by accepting his gift of atonement, we can achieve a higher state of existence with our Creator. In Judaism, there is this amazing binding sense of the covenants of deity with the children of Israel. And those children of Israel may be either by lineage related or by conversion related to this group, this covenant people. And that by keeping the traditions and the covenants, people can enhance their spirituality and come closer to God. And then in Islam, there are many ways of improving behavior. And there are 4 levels of behavior: behaviors that you should always do, behaviors you should never do, and several levels in between. And this encourages the development of individual virtues and characteristics that help us to live in peace with one another and with God. And so as we think about spiritual gifts that may resonate with you from one faith tradition, I just wanted to sort of lay the groundwork for understanding that there are many different ways that we might understand what a spirit is and what a spiritual gift may be. And it looks like most of you have received the handout by now, so you'll see in very fine print, and I'm sorry that it's so small, but you will see a very partial list of some types of things that I've sort of picked and chosen from those different traditions. And I admit that I picked and chose them a little bit, but as different ways of thinking about what a spiritual gift or a spiritual manifestation may be in these different traditions. So as we talk about strengthening spiritual gifts, I want to draw a parallel with other things that we already are good at strengthening. So one example would be strengthening the body. So you can think about the food that you eat and the exercise that you engage or plan to engage or hope to engage or make commitments to engage on a regular basis. And you understand that the more you use your body in a certain physical way, whether that is running or lifting weights or practicing yoga, that as you engage that, you become more and more able to engage it easily, that your body adapts and that your body learns and grows and strengthens. So that's a pretty natural way to kind of understand this principle of strengthening. You also have engaged education pretty deeply and continue to practice your craft of law and of leadership. And so you also understand the principle of strengthening the mind. If you think back to your first semester in law school, I don't know if you remember what that was like. I haven't actually been to law school, but I've got a couple of advanced degrees. And so I remember what the first semester of each of those was like. I imagine it's much the same. And when I talk to law students, they say it's much the same. But do you remember how impossible it felt? Right? There were moments where it felt like your instructors were asking you to do something that was not like possible in this realm. And over time, your capacity changed. It's not that what they asked of you changed. In fact, they may have been steadily increasing your load over time and increasing the dimensions and the ways that you were thinking about things and the skills that you were gaining. But you became more capable of managing that amount of information and that type of logic and those ways of approaching the world and the law and other people. And so you can strengthen your mind in those ways. The spirit is the same way. There's this idea that you can strengthen your spirit. And I'm going to acknowledge here that this idea of like focusing on yourself, this is a very Western idea, and that many of the Eastern traditions would actually suggest exactly the opposite, that we need to be letting go of that self. But that is still a spiritual practice that one can become better at. So whichever direction you're going, whether you're sort of focusing inward and trying to strengthen yourself and become better, or if you're focusing on letting go of that self and becoming more one and in harmony with the divinity around you, in either case, these involve practices, and over time they become easier. I remember the first time I went and I was trying to learn meditation, which is by itself just sort of a paradox. But I was at a Zen Buddhist temple in Salt Lake City. I was in college, and the monks led these practices to teach people how to meditate. And again, this is going to be a very Western approach, but like I was bad at it, right? Like I was really bad at it. The idea of being mindful and fully present and like letting go of all of my worries and letting go of like my schoolwork and you know, the things I was thinking about at home and my relationships and all of that, I was just like, I wasn't super able to do that. And over time, as I've engaged meditative practices, I've gotten a little bit more able to sort of have moments of peace like that. And there's this one thing that I will always remember from my experiences there, and it was the monks telling the story about how, well, it wasn't really a story, but explaining how there are many different types of meditations. And one of the meditations they said was a sweeping meditation, because we got to sweep eventually. Like, you know, the floors get dusty and you've got to sweep. And so they said sweeping is a meditation. We have a meditation for sweeping. And the idea is to be fully one with this idea that you're sweeping the floor. And like the idea of that was so foreign to me that it has stuck with me for all this time, but like sweeping as a meditative practice. And I think in some ways that was the precursor to some of what I'm going to talk about today. For me, it changed my perspective about what can be a spiritual practice. The Buddha said, before enlightenment, you chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, you chop wood and carry water. So if you think about the tasks and the work that you do in your daily life, what is the chopping wood? What is the carrying water? What are those tasks that are involved here in your leadership with the Law Society? What is the chopping wood and carrying water? And one of the things we're going to explore is how can you use that to enhance your connection with the divine? So you're going to have an idea of what spiritual gifts are from your own faith tradition. Some of them may or may not be on my little handout, but you have the opportunity to sort of explore that set of gifts. And then I would invite you to look at some of the ideas from another faith tradition, or maybe even on that list from a tradition that may align more closely with your own. And you might find some that you hadn't noticed. If you are LDS, for example, you'll notice the biblical spiritual gifts are there, and then there's an additional list of LDS ones. And some of those, if you're LDS, you may not recognize. They're from a talk by Elder Ashton. And he gave a beautiful talk about how there are many more spiritual gifts than we really give credit for, and that it's far beyond the limited list that's provided in the Doctrine and Covenants and in the Bible, and to some extent in the Book of Mormon as well. And so he gave some examples, and that's where many of those items come from. And then the other thing that you want to think about is that sometimes you will discover spiritual gifts that aren't on any list, that you weren't necessarily intentionally trying to develop, but that are born of your own experience and born of your pursuit of divinity or enlightenment. And so identifying what it is that you see or experience that is divine can expand your view of what those divine gifts may be. I love this quote from Bruce R. McConkie in the LDS tradition. The gifts of the Spirit are infinite in number and endless in their manifestations, because God himself is infinite and endless, and because the needs of those who receive them are as numerous, varied, and different as there are people in the kingdom. I love that idea of infinite manifestations of the divine, and that if we look for them, we will see them everywhere. This description from a Hindu perspective says special revelations are very difficult for Hindus to explain to non-believers. There's very little evidence for them. They're generally only experienced by one person, which means an appreciation of these revelations is through faith. Special revelations can also be difficult for Hindus to understand. While some actively follow those they believe have revelations, for others who have never experienced a vision personally, it can be quite hard to accept someone else's vision as being directly from God. I had a very close friend growing up in high school who participated in Hindu meditations and sought these manifestations through dreams and visions. And I remember the most beautiful conversations with him where we would share our commonalities, our ideas about these manifestations and visions and dreams and how that happened may have come from very different faith traditions. But the fact that he was experiencing divine personal revelations in his faith tradition, much like I was experiencing, I think we lost another battery. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Much as I was experiencing divine manifestations in my own religious practice, gave us common ground for talking about things, even though our approaches and our spiritual backgrounds were very, very different. And I learned things from him that I was able to incorporate into my own personal spiritual practice. And I like to think that he did the same. And together, we both witnessed the divine, even though we were coming from these very different perspectives. Julie B. Beck. Oh, here's another one. Yay. Thank you.
It just turned itself off.
Sorry about the feedback, you guys. Yeah, no problem. Spiritual gifts are numerous and varied and come to us as we seek them and use them appropriately. We enjoy them because of the power of the Holy Ghost, which is in and around and woven through our lives. This again comes out of the LDS tradition, but this idea of divinity being woven through everything, I think is an idea that is present in many other traditions as well. And then this one out of Hinduism: only human life offers the chance to learn the eternal spiritual truth. Therefore, Hindus believe that it is important to use the opportunity of a human birth to understand who we are and who God is. In this way, we can end the cycle of reincarnation and be reunited with the eternal spiritual reality, or God. So the idea that life, that mortality is the time to sort of connect with the divine, and that we have these lessons to learn here, sort of makes this idea of gaining spiritual revelations and spiritual gifts important. And so one of the things that I'd like to invite you to do is think about this list of gifts. And I want you to see if you can identify one that you have. Like, start there. Find one that you have. As you look at the list, you may discover that you have more than one. What are your many gifts? Maybe you have some that are stronger than others. Maybe there are some that you have or have had in the past but don't have now. What are those gifts for you? And then fourth, what gifts have you witnessed in others? Are there any on that list that you look at and you're like, no, that's not me, or no, I haven't experienced that, or no, I haven't developed that yet? But you see something and someone else comes to mind and you think, I know someone who has experienced this, or has this characteristic or virtue, or knows how to do this. And then I want you to think about how you know. How do these things manifest themselves? And when do they manifest themselves? Do they manifest themselves only during your spiritual practice, or does the item that you've identified show up elsewhere in your life and lighten the load of the burdens that you carry, that wood that you chop and that water that you carry? Can you identify things there that manifest themselves in your legal practice? Are there things on that list that are gifts, spiritual gifts, manifestations of the divine, that have helped you with your work as a leader in the Law Society? Maybe you're patient. Maybe you're a good communicator. Maybe you're really good at organizing things. Recognizing those not only as professional skills and not only as character traits, but of manifestations of divinity can transform the work that you do into a spiritual practice where you work to enhance those gifts, or through the work that you're doing, become more unified with the people and ethos around you. So witnessing that can be powerful. There have been times when I've talked to people about spiritual gifts and they literally believed they had none. And the idea that they actually were spiritually gifted was a revelatory moment for them. I don't know if you fall into that category, but taking a moment to say, look, I have witnessed the divine, either in myself or in others, can be a really powerful moment. So enjoy that. Then I want you to think about one of those items on that list, or maybe it's not on that list, maybe it's something else. What is something that you want to focus on? And I'm going to challenge you now to sort of narrow this down to something that you could focus on in your practice as a leader here in this group. Whether that's with the groups that you lead when you leave, or if you're on the leadership team here for the whole society. In any of those cases, think about one of those items that you could develop or focus on or be mindful about as you engage the work that you do. Now, in thinking about that, you may actually, again, have to think about what is the chopping wood and carrying water that you do. It may be having meetings, right? Meetings. It may be, writing memos or briefs. It might be arranging service opportunities. It might be recruiting people to participate. It might be convincing people that spirituality belongs in the practice of law. It might be conversing with people clearly, right? Any of this might be your chopping wood and carrying water. What is it? What spiritual gift could you use, develop, focus on while you do that work? And if there's one on that sheet, go ahead and circle it. If it's not on that sheet, write it down. But I want you to physically connect with that concept, that gift, whatever it is. The idea of strengthening spiritual gifts was talked about a little bit by Russell M. Nelson in his talk, Spiritual Treasures. He says, you won't find this process spelled out in any manual. The Holy Ghost will be your personal tutor as you seek to understand what the Lord would have you know and do. This process is neither quick nor easy, but it is spiritually invigorating. What could possibly be more exciting than to labor with the Spirit to understand God's power? So, as you think about those practices, I don't know, is that the fan? It's a very loud fan. As you think about those personal practices and specifically that focal gift, we're gonna sort of go through an exercise. So on the other side of your handout, you'll see at the top an opportunity to write down your focal spiritual gift. So whatever you just identified, hopefully you circled it or already wrote it down, you can write it down right there. Here's the gift that I'm going to focus on. This is what I want to be mindful about. This is what I want to be intentional about. This is what I want to develop. This is what I want to witness, right? This gift. And then I want you to think about the practices that help you generally develop your spirituality. And usually when I say that, there's a list that comes to mind, and something on that list is going to be more prominent than everything else on that list. So in addition to just thinking about what those practices are, I want you to think about what is that one practice that came immediately to mind, your spiritual practice that you use to strengthen your spirituality that showed up when I asked that question, and write that down. Write that down under my inspired practice, right? That might be a place where your inner wisdom and or the Spirit and or divinity is communicating to you that more of that practice might be useful for you in your life, whatever that was. It may be prayer, meditation, yoga, temple attendance, meeting with your congregation, family home evening, could be any number of things, right? And then on the right, you can list other personal practices that you think of when you think of strengthening your spirituality. Scripture study might be on that same list. Pondering, listening to general conference. Depending on what your faith tradition is, there might be a different list for you. And then I want you, once you've sort of thought about that, this little wheel on your handout that's sort of divided up into quarters, that's your daily wheel. So I want you to take a typical day, a typical work day, right? Like for most of us, that's a Monday through Friday sort of situation. And I want you to think of that little circle as a 24-hour period. And I want you to mark out how much, like you're going to use like a pie chart. This is the one time in life I teach statistics. This is the one time in life I'm ever going to use a pie chart because pie charts are evil. But we're going to use them today because I'm thinking of more as a clock than as a pie chart. And I want you to identify how much of your day do you spend engaged in those purposeful spiritual practices, the ones that you generally identify as spiritual practices. How much of your day do you spend doing that? So this might include, again, prayer, meditation, scripture study, temple worship, church attendance or activities, service opportunities, religious affiliated events, moments of mindfulness, etc. If you're like most audiences that I talk to, that slice is small, right? If you're among the temporally blessed, you might have as much as an hour out of 24 to spend on that, maybe even 2, which would be just like, that just sounds glorious to me. On a daily basis, maybe you're in a habit, you're in a place in your life where you get to do things like maybe attend the temple on a daily basis. So maybe you're up to like 3 hours. But for most of us, even that 3 or 4 or even 5 out of 24 is a small slice of that full day. So I want you to think for a minute about what are the other things taking up your time. You've done this before, right? We've all had some moment by this time in our lives where we're like thinking about time management and our daily slices of pie and kind of what that looks like. So you can quickly, right, draw out, okay, well, I spend about this much time sleeping and it might be better to like do a little bit more of that. And maybe I spend this much time exercising. I spend this much time engaged in relationship activities with my friends or family or spouse or children. And then I spend this amount of time doing paid work or volunteer work. And maybe some small slice of that might be your service here with the Law Society. When you look at the sheer magnitude of each day that is taken up with work tasks, and then recast those work tasks as an opportunity for spiritual development and growth, all of a sudden our very small spiritual slices of the pie become much larger. So how can something like holding a meeting or sending emails or reaching out to potential volunteer sites be a spiritual practice? How can that be? Right? Because that's what I'm suggesting you do. And that's what I'm suggesting we all do, is take these daily tasks, these spaces where we're working and we're leading, and to approach them intentionally as spiritual practices. I have come to a practice in my own life where I try to think about all the things that I do in a day and all of the activities that I carry out and attach to them a particular type of spiritual growth that I'm seeking. I'll give you an example that's not work related and then I'll shift into work. So I'm a beekeeper. And bees are fun. I don't know if there are other beekeepers in the room. Anybody? Yeah, like it's super fun to talk about and like think about and do. But the bees get a little edgy. Like they can, it's almost as though they can sense how I am. And honestly, for me, I'm a new beekeeper. And so opening my hive and like getting in there with bees that I know can sting me is still a little scary for me when I do it. And so for me, this has very much become a mindfulness practice where I try to clear my mind of everything that I'm doing, but the very specific task at hand. And this isn't for me any of the ideas that are coming out of my Western faith tradition where I'm like, you know, praying during that moment necessarily, although that happens sometimes too. But in those moments, what I'm trying to do is develop my spiritual instrument, right? And so as I approach the bees, I will remind myself, I'll usually use some words that remind me, now is a time to be mindful. And I will walk and move with purpose. And I will try to have a singular focus with everything that I do as a spiritual practice, as something that I want to get better at. And that has been a transferable skill, specifically in my work with students. So a big part of my job is mentoring students. They come to my office, they need mentorship. I am sure that in the practice of law, you have the opportunity to do this sometimes too. Yes, sometimes it's about writing the contracts or figuring out the legalities of something, but many times the person across that desk from you needs a moment of connection, right? They need your presence. And if I'm thinking about my to-do list or all the million things that I need to do, I am not mindfully there with that student who sometimes is bringing me a significant question or challenge that they're facing in their lives. I think now about like family law. Think about like the experiences that people might be having on the other end of that desk and the distress that they might be in. Or if you're thinking about things like defense law or other practices, right? There are moments where that person across the desk from you needs you to be fully present with them. The fact that I work on presence and mindfulness with the bees makes me more able to connect with that person in that moment. And in fact, that now can become its own spiritual practice. How do I connect with others? And so when I have a student come in, that is the spiritual practice that I engage with them, is how can I, and this does not come naturally for me. I am a very shy introvert. That is true. And connecting with others can be difficult for me sometimes because I recharge by being alone. So that's sort of antithetical, but that has become its own spiritual practice for me. Seeking the ability to connect with others, connecting with others, serving others meaningfully in the moment, for me, has become a spiritual practice. So I want to challenge you. You'll see there's a bold line there. What daily activities can I use to strengthen my focal spiritual gift? So you identified a spiritual gift. What daily activities, not the normal spiritual practices that people would think of as spiritual practices, but what normal daily activity could you use to strengthen that gift? If you're seeking the gift of patience, maybe dealing with the kids in the morning on the way, getting them out the door for school, maybe that's an opportunity to practice this gift, right? Or maybe you're seeking more personal revelation. Can you seek personal revelation about the work that you do in your job? And now dedicate that work time to this spiritual practice, for example. And then the next line, what leadership activities can I use to strengthen my focal spiritual gift? So here we're going to take it specifically into leadership in the Law Society. What is a way that you can strengthen your focal spiritual gift through the service that you give to the society and the work that you do, the wood that you chop, the water that you carry here in the Law Society? How can you do that? So as you start thinking about moving this into your workspace and your service space, it can be a hard habit to develop. And there are a few ways that I've found that help me to remember to engage that, because otherwise the habits of work life and in some cases long decades of training and how to think about things and how to do things, and the automation in your own mind and body that happen when you approach work can kind of take over. And it can be months, you'll be like, oh wait, I was going to do this thing and I forgot. And you've missed all those opportunities for mindful development of your connection with the divine. And so in addition to identifying daily activities, I encourage you to create reminders of your practice. And there are 4 specific ones, and you can see them down kind of at the bottom of the handout. The question is, how will I remind myself to engage my spiritual practice in this activity? And there are 4 ideas about how to do that. One of them is to identify, and I'm using the word mantra appears there, and I'm using that in the very Western sense of like, I'm going to choose words and imbue them with meaning. Okay, so what is a phrase that you can say to yourself, or even write down and post somewhere that will remind you that that's what you're doing, right? As I approach the bees, now is a time to be mindful, is what I say to myself. But you could have just like a little phrase, and you can practice saying that phrase as you approach that task, even, yes, if it's responding to emails or holding a meeting. Right? Remind yourself what is going to be for you the spiritual purpose of that meeting or that engagement with other people around you. What are you trying to achieve that is divine, not just temporal, not just getting the work done, but that will develop you as a person? The second is creating a visual reminder. So maybe you write those words down, maybe you put a picture in place that will remind you. But creating a visual cue that will help you to remember that that's what you're trying to do when you approach this practice can be really helpful. The third one is really fun, and that is to get a buddy, right? Find someone else, and you can do this with the language of spirituality and divinity, or you can do it in the very secular version of like thinking about developing positive character traits or mindfulness skills. Those are ideas that are common enough that it isn't necessarily going to introduce conversations if you're not ready in that particular context to have those conversations. But again, I would invite you, and I think it's consistent with the mission of the society, to open your spiritual life to others and let them know, I am trying to make this a spiritual practice. I'm new at it. I'm not sure what this is going to look like, but hey, do you want to engage this with me? And then you can watch each other and support each other and remind each other in that. So doing this with a buddy is really, it can be really fun. And then the fourth one is probably my favorite, and that is identify a celebration. Like when you have done it, when you have either demonstrated this character trait. Remember how we thought about like, what are the manifestations of that spiritual gift? How do you know that it's there? What do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? When you've witnessed that spiritual gift or that personal growth or that manifestation of the divine, maybe what you're doing is you're looking for the divinity in others or divine guidance in the work that you're doing. When you witness that in yourself or others or the world around you, how will you celebrate, right? How do you take a moment to say, I felt that, right? I felt that. That was real. I just witnessed divinity. Sometimes we use that in the language of miracles, and sometimes it's part of people's natural vernacular. They're like, oh, this meeting really came together and it was a miracle, right? It's like a little mini celebration of the opportunity to connect in ways that you were intentional about connecting. And that's exciting, and celebrating it is fun. So the third piece of this is, how can you use this? And this is a very leadership concept, right? How can you use these ideas to lift others, inclusive of other faith traditions, inclusive of where people might be on their own spiritual path? How can you invite others, whether in your work in the society or your work in the law? How can you invite others to strengthen their spiritual gifts as well? One of the things that you can do is look for your own goal gift in others, and then tell them you witnessed it and celebrate that with them. You were so patient with that really irritating client today. And I am personally trying to develop patience, and I just wanted to let you know that I saw that in you, and it was beautiful, right? Witnessing the gifts that you want in others reminds you that they exist, reminds you that it's possible, reminds you that you're on that path, and gives you an opportunity to strengthen that gift in them while you're on your way to strengthening it as well. So you can do that with lots of things, right? You can witness the divinity in others in lots of ways, and I encourage you to do that. But one of the very cool things you can do is witness in others what you're hoping for in yourself. And that is going to not only strengthen them, but strengthen you at the same time. So now might actually be a good moment to look outside, because I just want us to take a moment to appreciate that it is possible to experience divinity. It is possible to have, receive, and develop spiritual gifts and a greater connection with the divine and an ability to sort of transcend whatever state we're in and expand beyond it. And so that's one of the things that happens for me when I look at that glorious view. I mean, on my slide, I've got like a little pretty flower. I think that's a California poppy, maybe, or Iceland poppy. I don't remember what kind of flower that is. But anyway, it's in black and white, not nearly as pretty as what we're looking at outside. So look out there instead. But take a moment to feel what that feels like, that breath of freshness and of beauty and of something that is grander than where you are now, and connect with that. Feel that divinity within you, like resonate with the divinity that you can witness out there. That same idea is what we want to do, not just when we're praying or meditating or attending church or studying scriptures or listening to the sages, right? Or practicing yoga. We want to be able to feel that sense of connection, that breath of divinity in everything that we do. And it is in fact possible, but it is a lifelong practice. And I invite you to join me in that practice as we grow and strengthen together. Spiritual gifts are infinite in number and endless in their manifestation. And I am so grateful for the opportunity to be here today, to work on my own practice, standing here in front of you, sharing these ideas. And I hope you have a wonderful remainder of your conference. Thank you.